So, in the video prior to this, that wasn't a terrible podcast, I tried to give a brief overview of Vladimir Putin's rise to power. Here, I'm talking about the 8 or so years after Putin became the president of Russia, when he consolidated his position as an autocrat and undid many of the gains Russia had made to legitimate democracy and functioning state. Yay.
Все, буксир остановился, люди с пулемета.
To understand how Putin consolidated in the way that he did, I think it's important to understand the state of Russia in the 90s. It was shit. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia was in dire economic straits, and for many Russians, their national identity was shaken. The 1994 to 1996 First Chechen War did not help things. The history of that republic is, like any other, very complicated. Simply, Chechnya has resisted Russian rule since the 18th century. The Chechens fought the Russians for almost 50 years in the 19th century in a grueling on-again, off-again war. More than 500,000 Chechens were murdered during Soviet ethnic cleansing in the 1940s. With the collapse of the USSR, a highly motivated independence movement in Chechnya sprang to life, as well as plenty of intrastate violence. Chechnya declared independence in November 1991. Factions vied for power, many people were brutally killed, and tens of thousands of ethnic Chechens fled, all while the Yeltsin government interfered and armed various groups. Early in the war, Russian armed forces were humiliated at the Battle of Grozny, the Chechen capital. The defending Chechens, many Soviet army veterans, formed a badly outnumbered and outgunned irregular force. The Russians expected to take Grozny easily, and on paper they should have, but the Chechens were, for the most part, patriots fighting conscripts, and they knew Russian military doctrine well. Columns of tanks were lured into traps, where the first and last vehicles were destroyed, and the remainder picked off at the Chechens' leisure. The Russians eventually took Grozny, but at the expense of thousands of their own troops, and tens of thousands of civilians. Ultimately, the Russians lost the war. In half a decade, Russia had gone from one of the world's superpowers, theoretically able to project influence anywhere on the globe, to being unable to quash a local rebellion. But Chechnya was deeply scarred by the First War. Factions still fought each other, and the Russians still played them off against each other. Outside of Grozny, the Republic became lawless. In August of 1999, a senior figure in the Chechen independence movement, Shamil Basayev, led between 1,000 to 2,000 Islamist fighters into neighboring Dagestan to aid local Wahhabists in their attempt to overthrow the Dagestani government. Russia began airstrikes all across the region, but their ground invasion and the usually cited date for the beginning of the Second Chechen War didn't begin until September. In that month, triggering the Russian ground invasion, bombs targeting apartment buildings exploded in 4 Russian cities. 307 people were killed, and more than 1,000 were injured. People were terrified. They were being targeted in their own homes. The Chechens denied responsibility, but the Russian government denied their denial. After all, Who would do such a thing? The reason this is important to Putin's consolidation is because it created a very specific environment that allowed Putin to seize control of any meaningful way of opposing him in the name of security. It is important to say that many people believe Putin was involved in the bombings, perhaps even ordering them. This would certainly have been possible, as although he was the head of the FSB until August, his connections went well beyond that, and he was close friends with the new FSB director. By close friends, I of course mean political allies. I cannot say with certainty that Putin did it, or even that he allowed it to happen, only that it did happen, and it served to give Putin something to fix. Putin became acting president on the 31st of December, 1999. By that time, the Russian invasion of Chechnya was in full swing, and Grozny was under siege. Before the war was over, something very strange happened. Putin's tutor and lifelong friend, Anatoly Sobchak, had a heart attack and died on the 20th of February 2000. Putin had met him only 3 days before and asked him to immediately fly to Kaliningrad to campaign for Putin's presidency, which Sobchak did. That's not the weird part. Sobchak travelled with 2 assistants, really bodyguards. Much younger than the 62-year-old Sobchak, both men had to be treated for heart problems too, at the same time. It seems Sobchak was in fact poisoned, possibly through a specially prepared vapor. Why did Putin do this, if he really did do this? Well, Sobchak and Putin had known each other for a very long time, and if anyone had dirt on old Putler, it was probably Sobchak. But it has been suggested that the reason might be as simple as Sobchak liked to talk. He liked to reminisce, and that was a danger for the legend and elusive myth Putin was trying to build for himself. Putin appeared distraught at the funeral, but if we dare to be cynical just for a moment, that's a positive in terms of political points, isn't it? By the time the 2000 presidential elections came around, Russia was on the verge of winning the Second Chechen War, and by the end of May, Putin re-established federal control over the republic and installed a pro-Moscow government. But his first act as official, not acting but totally legit president, was to redo Russian geographical bureaucracy. The 1993 Russian Federation's constitution divided the country into 85 federal entities, 22 of which, like Chechnya, are republics. On the 18th of May 2000, Putin created 7 federal districts, sometimes called super districts, which, because are non-existent in the 93 constitution, allowed him to centralize power completely legally, or at least without violating the constitution directly. Each district was carefully drawn to include a variety of ethnicities, and so that there were no district capitals located in any ethnic republic, diminishing the influence of these republics relative to Moscow, and preventing any district-wide ethnic unity that might, potentially, oppose him. Putin then set up the so-called Cossack Commission in June 2001 to examine the division of powers between the government and regions. The commission, which in reality Putin controlled, recommended minimizing the autonomy of local powers and pushing control up to the federal government and ultimately to Putin. In January of 2002, Putin revoked the right of governors and chairs of regional assemblies to participate in the upper house of parliament, or Federation Council. New laws allowed Putin to remove local leadership, even if democratically elected, at will, and removed criminal immunity that had earlier shielded, albeit temporarily, critics like Yuri Shutov. Essentially, Putin retained the idea and structure of a federation, but really turned it on its head, so that leaders of federal states weren't beholden to their constituents, but rather to him. So in terms of controlling the political mechanism of Russia, Putin had that sewn up pretty quickly. But there was still the problem of the people. The ongoing insurgent fighting in Chechnya, if not outright war, gave Putin a good cover for violating his own constitution. Journalists were always going to be a problem, and although they were harassed and threatened, sometimes beaten or kidnapped, sometimes killed, Putin really started getting a grip on the people with the oligarchs. Corruption was not, and still is not, at all unusual in Russia. It is rather so ingrained that it is not possible to conduct business without it. This means that anyone could be silenced if the spotlight was swiveled at them. In 2003, Mikhail Khodorkovsky was the richest man in Russia. He was the CEO of the country's second largest oil company. He was highly influential and donated funding across the political spectrum. But the real problem was that he was noisy. Was he corrupt? Undoubtedly, but that's not really why the FSB arrested him, and why he ended up in Siberia. In short, through a series of buyouts and mergers, Khodorkovsky's company was more or less nationalized, meaning the government acquired sizable control of the entire country's oil industry. There were many other oligarchs too that Putin either found a neat way to dispose of or make deals with. And by deal I mean, if you play your cards right, I might let you live. His purpose for keeping some of these fat cats around is not always clear in terms of building power and eliminating potential dissent. But that wasn't the only thing Putin was interested in. He was, from the very beginning, accumulating his own personal wealth too. And the richest Russians were perfect proxies for both stealing money and hiding his own assets. In 2004, Putin won his second term with 71.9% of the vote. Just as in 2000, the elections were not free. Ballot boxes were stuffed, and the North Caucasus district had an incredibly high turnout, with some regions casting more than 95% of their votes for Putin. These first 4 years were the critical time of consolidation for Putin, but threats and problems still remained. The continued fighting in Chechnya served as a convenient scapegoat for domestic problems and as a target for national ire. But the Beslan school siege, which ended in over 300 dead, including almost 200 children, prompted outrage at the government's handling of the situation. There was a good deal of outspoken criticism of Putin's government and Putin himself at the time. But ultimately, this atrocity galvanized Putin's grip. In response to Beslan, later in 2004, the Russian parliament approved reforms that ended local elections determining regional governors, passing their nomination to the president and their confirmation by local legislature, of course controlled, one way or another, by Putin. So he went from being able to dismiss local leaders at will to essentially being able to pick them. Putin continued his crackdown on journalists. Maximov, Varisov, Kozulin, Politkovskaya, too many to mention, all killed by the state. Public protests, such as the Dissenters' March, were stifled and crushed. The Special Purpose Mobile Unit beat protesters. Organizers were arrested, Russian media called them extremists. But then, in 2008, the real test of how well Putin had the country under his fist came. The Constitution barred him from a third consecutive term, but he had planned for this. Dmitry Medvedev, like Putin, had been a student of Anatoly Sobchak, and he was a long-time political ally of Putin. He was the first deputy prime minister of Russia from 2005 to 2008. He won the presidency in elections the Parliamentary Assembly Council of Europe described as neither free nor fair, and he immediately appointed Vladimir Putin to be his prime minister. Now, from the outside, this may have looked dangerous for Putin's quest for power until death. He had built a mechanism for retaining power that now was apparently in the hands of someone else. But really, that mechanism wasn't about protecting the president. It's difficult to give solid answers on how Putin controlled Medvedev, or many others, no matter how obsequious, because although much of his consolidation took place through recodifying the law, much of it is surely far darker. Simply, there is no such thing as a former intelligence officer. And that's where we leave things for now. Next, Putin faces a more personal challenge. If he can rule Russia without even being the president, if he is now undefeatable, where does he go next to quench his burning ambition for personal glory? He could always go crazy. But he wouldn't, would he?